Imagine you were a tired Royal Navy sailor. Months at sea, salt in your clothes, rats in the bread. One morning, your ship sights a tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific. On the charts, it's basically nothing. An almost forgotten name, Pitcairn. You expect rock, maybe birds, at most, a few shipwrecked lunatics. Instead, as your boat pulls closer, you see something that makes your skin prickle. Neat little houses, smoke from cooking fires, children watching you from the ridge. When you go ashore, they line up politely. They speak English. They read the Bible. They pray before meals. And then they tell you their names. Christian, Yun, Quintal, McCoy. Names you've seen before, on wanted lists. And standing behind them is one old man, John Adams, the last living mutineer of His Majesty's ship Bounty. What most of these children don't really know is that just 10 years earlier, this same island was soaked in blood. Almost every adult man here either killed or was killed. How did a brutal ship's mutiny turn into this hidden village of survivors? To answer that, we have to go back 25 years, to a mission that was never supposed to end like this. The Bounty did not leave England as a pirate ship. It left as a planned truck. In 1787, the Admiralty gave Lieutenant William Bligh a small ship and a cold-blooded job: sail to Tahiti, collect breadfruit plants, move them to the Caribbean to feed enslaved workers on British sugar plantation, cheap calories for people treated as property. The Bounty was tiny, about 90 feet long. 46 men crammed aboard. Bligh knew the oceans. He'd sailed with Captain James Cook. He had a sharp memory for charts and an even sharper tongue. His second-in-command, Fletcher Christian, from England, they headed for Cape Horn and were smashed back by storm after storm. Days of screaming wind, ice on the rigging, men half-frouncing at the ropes. Eventually Bligh gave up and took the long way round, via the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean. By the time the Bounty finally slid into Tahiti's Matabai Bay, in October 1788, the crew was exhausted and half-broken. Tahiti was the opposite of everything they'd just endured. Warm, green, fruit hanging off trees, fish thick in the lagoon, people who welcomed them. They thought it would be a quick stop. 5 months later, half the crew had changed everything: their clothes, their skin, their loyalties. Sailors took Tahitian women as lovers or informal wives. They got tattoos. They built little houses on shore. They slept in real beds for the first time in years. For many, Tahiti started to feel less like a port and more like home. Bligh watched discipline dissolving. He raged over theft of food. He cursed officers in front of the men. He dragged people back to the ship, back to drills, back to rules. By April 1789, the breadfruit were finally loaded. Bligh ordered the anchor raised. As Tahiti faded behind them, plenty of men on the Bounty felt the same quiet dread. They weren't sailing away from an island. They were being dragged away from the only happiness they'd ever known. Within a year, some of those same men would be pointing guns at their own captain. Not in battle but in the dark, while he slept. The ship drifted in the dark near Tafua on April 28, 1789. Most of the crew slept. A few did not. In the cramped shadows below deck, Fletcher Christian Saturday awake, turning a pistol over in his hands. 4 weeks, Bligh's insults had gotten worse. Thief. Coward. Damn scoundrel. Christian had tried to resign his post. Bligh refused. The pressure kept building. Tonight, he snapped. Quietly, Christian and a handful of allies armed themselves. Pistols, cutlasses, a length of rope. They moved fast. They kicked in Bligh's cabin door. The captain jerked awake, choking on his own shout as men piled onto him. Rope bit into his wrists. Salt-wet hemp scraped his skin as they dragged him up into the cool air. Lantern lights swung crazily. Half-dressed men stared. Mr. Christian, what is this? Is this a joke? Bligh shouted. Christian looked him straight in the eyes and said, Simply, no, sir, not a joke. That was the moment the Bounty stopped being a king's ship. They forced Bligh and his loyal men into the ship's small open launch. Some crew hesitated on the rail, torn between captain and friends. One midshipman stepped forward to join Bligh, then Frouncey, paralyzed, and stayed aboard in confusion. 19 men ended up crammed into a 3 foot boat. A little food, a few tools, a sextant, no charts. Christian cut the painter. The Bounty turned away into the grey dawn, under the command of rebels. Behind her, Bligh's tiny boat rose and fell in the swell, drifting on an ocean that might as well have been endless. Bligh's 3,600-mile open boat voyage to safety is its own insane survival story. You can do a whole episode on that. Right now, we're staying on the stolen ship, with the men who thought they just escaped death. They had escaped one captain. They had not escaped the British Empire. Fletcher Christian now had everything and nothing. He had a ship, but he also had a guaranteed death sentence if the Navy ever caught him. The Pacific was huge, but it wasn't empty. Every major island, Tahiti, Tonga, the Society Islands, saw regular visits from British, French, or Spanish ships. Sooner or later, Bligh's story would reach them. Christian did something desperate. He turned the Bounty back to Tahiti. When they appeared offshore, the reaction on the beach was chaos and joy. The men rushed back to their Tahitian lovers and wives. Some wanted to stay for good and take their chances. When a British warship finally came, the crew split. 16 men stayed behind, including some who'd barely been part of the mutiny. They would later be rounded up by HMS Pandora and taken in chains to face trial. 9 mutineers, including Christian and the hardcore, chose a different fate, vanished completely. They didn't leave alone. They took with them 6 Tahitian men, 11 Tahitian women, and at least 1 baby. Some of those people went willingly. Some didn't. On that overcrowded ship, with more men than women, with lovers and ex-lovers and strangers jammed together, jealousy and resentment were already starting to boil. They'd escaped Bligh. Now they needed something even harder to escape, the map itself. Among the old charts on board was a tiny note, Pitcairn Island, cited by Philip Carteret in 1767. Carteret had messed up the coordinates. On official British charts, Pitcairn was drawn more than 100 miles from where it really was. For a navy hunting mutineers, that was a nuisance. For mutineers trying to disappear, it was a gift. Christian steered the Bounty into blue emptiness, away from known routes. Every day he stayed at sea, a British warship could appear over the horizon. Every night he had to look his followers in the eye and pretend he knew where he was going. Days passed, nothing but water. Hope thinned. And then, just when the search started to feel pointless, a lookout cried out. On the horizon, a dark spike rose from the sea. Steep cliffs, no welcoming lagoon, just rock, pounding surf, and dense green. Pitcairn. They eased the ship in closer. No harbor, no obvious anchorage, barely even a beach, but they saw fresh water, soil, trees, and no signs of other people. It was dangerous, it was small, but no one would casually find it. Christian made his final choice. This forgotten, mischarted rock would be their world. And to make sure no one ever connected Pitcairn to the Bounty, they went after the ship herself. They stripped her bare of everything useful: iron nails, tools, livestock, seeds, anything they could drag up the hill. Then, one night, they set her on fire. Flames crawled up the rigging, tar and timber roared as the masts became giant torches. The heat on their faces was like stepping into a furnace. Imagine standing on that cliff. No way back to Tahiti, no way back to England, just a burning ship, a black ocean, and an island you barely know. Someone suggested hiding the ship instead, leaving her anchored in some secret cove. But Christian knew, as long as the Bounty floated, the past was still attached to them, and the past meant a hanging rope. When the fire reached the powder and main timbers, the hull cracked and sank, hissing. into what would become Bounty Bay. The last link to England vanished beneath the waves. The flames hadn't just devoured a ship, they'd burned every way back. Burning the Bounty saved them from the Navy. It also trapped them on a tiny island with people who were about to become each other's worst enemies. At first, it almost worked. The little community on Pitcairn had 9 European mutineers, 6 Tahitian men, 11 Tahitian women, a baby, and tools, seeds, pigs, goats, plus fresh water. They cleared ground and planted yams, taro, plantains, sweet potatoes, breadfruit. They built wooden houses near a spring. They fished, they hunted birds. They learned the island's paths and cliffs. From a distance, you might have thought, they've done it, they've built their own secret Eden. Up close, the rot was already spreading. The European mutineers acted like masters. They carried muskets. They gave orders. The Tahitian men, who had crossed an ocean against their will, were told to work the fields, carry loads, and keep quiet. In a village this small, nothing is private. At night, if there was an argument in one house, everybody heard it. And everybody knew one more thing: there were more men than women. On an island you can walk across in under an hour. That kind of imbalance always explodes. A Tahitian man might see the woman he loved walk past on another man's arm, with no power to change it. Then came the final ingredient. Mutineer William McCoy discovered he could distill alcohol from the tea plant. The first time the liquor ran clear into a bottle, maybe it felt like a celebration. It turned out to be a weapon. Some of the men started drinking hard. The fights got uglier. Old grudges came roaring back with every bottle. There was no court, no judge, no admiral, no outside referee. On Pitcairn, every insult had only two possible outcomes: forgiveness or revenge. Soon, revenge won. The Tahitian men had had enough. Sometime around 1793, a group of them quietly agreed if they stayed passive, they'd die as slaves. If they fought, they might at least die as men. One morning, a mutineer was alone in his field, bent over the crops, sweat running down his back. He heard the faintest rustle in the bushes behind him. By the time he turned, a club was already swinging. Blow by blow, ambush by ambush, men fell shut in their doorways, killed on lonely paths, dragged down in their sleep. Fletcher Christian himself, romantic hero in later films, almost certainly died in this wave of violence, most likely shot in the back while working. The surviving Europeans struck back just as ruthlessly. With the help of some of the women, they hunted down the Tahitian men, killing them in turn. Within just a few years of landing, about half the adult men on Pitcairn were dead. Mutineers, Tahitian men, all mixed in the soil. The island, that was supposed to be an escape from violence, had become a tiny, isolated civil war. And the killing wasn't finished. McCoy's drinking worsened until, crazed with alcohol, he is said to have thrown himself off a cliff. Matthew Quintal, drunk and unpredictable, roamed the village with an axe, threatening to burn homes and kill everyone. At last, the remaining adults, Edward Young, John Adams, and some of the women stared at each other and realized, if they didn't stop Quintal, he would destroy them. They killed him too. By 1800, only 10 years after settling, 8 of the 9 original mutineers were dead, murdered, driven to suicide, destroyed by drink and rage. Only one European man was left alive, John Adams. All around him were Tahitian women and their children, playing among the graves of fathers they barely remembered. You wake up one morning and realize you're the last grown man on an island full of orphans. If you fall apart now, their whole world dies with you. What you decide next will decide whether this place lives or dies with you. John Adams had been part of the mutiny. He'd taken part in the early chaos. He was no saint. But with every other man gone, something shifted. If he drank himself to death, these children would grow up with no language for who they were, no link to anything beyond Pitcairn. Among the old trunks and salvaged boxes from the Bounty, Adams found 2 books, a Bible, a tattered book of common prayer. The pages were stained with salt and age, the ink was fading. They became his school and his law. He gathered the children and began teaching them the alphabet from Scripture. He read them the 10 Commandments. He taught hymns and prayers. He built, clumsily, a version of the strict Anglican Christianity he'd half absorbed in his youth. The women, each carrying trauma of loss and kidnapping and war, kept the gardens, raised the kids, and passed on Tahitian words and customs. The children of Pitcairn grew up speaking a rolling mix of 1-8 THCENTURY English and Tahitian. They knew the names of fish and birds, the verses of the Bible, and the stories of the men whose surnames they carried, men they would never meet. By the early 1800s, Pitcairn was no longer a camp of drunken mutineers. It was a tiny, isolated village, devout, literate, built from the ashes of massacre. And still, absolutely no one in the outside world knew they existed. If you're still watching, this is where the story flips one last time because the outside world is finally about to notice them. Until one day in 1808, a set of strange sails appeared on the horizon. The American sealing ship Topaz wasn't looking for anyone. Captain Mayhew Folger saw a small island on the horizon with a name on his chart that meant almost nothing: Pitcairn. As he sailed closer, he saw smoke, terraces, banana plants. Someone was living here. A small boat came out to meet him, rowed by sun-darkened young men in rough clothes, grinning curiously. When they came alongside, they did something Folger did not expect. They greeted him in English. Their words sounded old-fashioned, like something out of a worn-out book, but they were clearly British, and clearly not from any port he knew. Then they gave their names. Thursday, October Christian, George Young, Edward Quintal. Folger knew those surnames. He went ashore and met John Adams, now middle-aged, the patriarch of a village of about 40 people old but him born on the island. Adams, sitting under a tree with a Bible in his hands, told the whole story: the breadfruit mission, the mutiny, the flight, the burning of the Bounty, the drunkenness, the murders, the strange peace that followed. The Topaz stayed only briefly. Folger left, but he took the story with him. It passed slowly from ship to ship, port to port, until finally word reached the British Admiralty. The Bounty mutineers were not all dead. Their children were living on a mischarted island no one had bothered to look for. In 1814, 2 British warships, Britain and HMS Bounty, were sent to sea. As their boats went ashore, Adams knew the law. He was a mutineer, a possible killer. Men had already been hanged in England for what he'd done. If they took him, the village would lose its only adult man, its teacher, its judge. The officers found a scene that didn't match any wanted poster: polite, literate children reciting prayers, women tending gardens, an old man who admitted everything and then showed them the community he'd helped build out of that guilt. On the deck of their frigates, the captains faced a choice: obey the letter of naval law, or leave this strange little society intact. They chose mercy. They left John Adams on Pitcairn, effectively granting him an unofficial pardon. The Bounty mutineers had done the impossible. They had not only escaped, they had outlived their own legend. Think about what they actually pulled off. A handful of junior sailors rose against the most powerful navy on Earth. They used a mistake on a map as a shield. They burned their own ship to erase every path home. They carved a life out of a 2-mile rock in the middle of nowhere. They vanished for almost 20 years. But look at the cost. Of the 9 mutineers who settled on Pitcairn, 8 died violently or in self-destructive spirals. The dream of freedom they chased turned, on that island, into paranoia, addiction, and murder. The people who truly survived the mutiny on the Bounty were not Fletcher Christian and his friends. They were the Tahitian women dragged across an ocean and the children who grew up among their graves and somehow built something gentler than the world their fathers made. If you trace the whole arc of this story, it runs through 5 brutal stages: rebellion, flight, hidden survival, collapse, rebirth. If this harsher, real version of the Bounty story made you rethink what it really costs to escape authority, hit like. It helps this kind of true survival story reach more people. And if you want a full breakdown of Bligh's insane 3,600-mile open-boat survival voyage to the other side of this story, tell me in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss it. Sometimes, when people run from power to build their own world at the edge of the map, they discover that the most dangerous thing out there is still themselves.